The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and thank you all so much for joining us today for the Income Manager Client Briefing Query Wizard webcast. I'm Tara Healy with Advanced Solutions International, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. So before we get started and I turn everything over to your presenter, I just want to go over a few items to ensure that we're all on the same page with the GoToWebinar system. On the front middle of your screen, you should see the very first slide of today's presentation with Advanced Solutions International at the top. And to the right of that is your control panel. If you want to remove the control panel and just view the presentation, you can click the little orange highlighted arrow. It'll push your control panel over to a toolbar. That arrow remains, and if you click on it again, your control panel will come back into full view for you. As I stated before, I'll be moderating the session, so if you run into any audio or visual glitches, if you could go down to the bottom of your control panel, you'll see a box that says questions. Type in whatever that might be, and if it's something on my end, I will try to get you back up and running as quickly as possible. Also, when we get to the end of today's presentation and we open it up for Q&A, I'm going to ask that you use that same question panel, and at any point during today's presentation, if you have a question that arises, type it up, send it over, and I'll facilitate through those questions, reading them one by one in the order in which they came in, so everyone will hear the question that you've asked, and then, of course, hear our presenter's response. We do realize that sometimes you need to go offline for further information, and you might choose to just save your questions for that. So contact information will be provided to you at the end as well. So now with all that being said, I'd like to go ahead and turn everything over to Michael Baldwin, your presenter for today. So Michael, it is all yours.
Thank you very much, Tara, and welcome everyone to the Income Manager client briefing on Query Wizard. I know we have a number of people on our session today, so welcome everyone from, I think, across Canada and some in the US. As you all know, I think that by this time, Income Manager was acquired by Advanced Solutions International several years ago. And you may also know that ASI also has its own member management fundraising platform and product called Imus. Sometimes we get asked questions, what is the commitment of ASI towards the Income Manager product line? I just want to assure you all that ASI is committed to the continued enhancement, development, support, and training of the Income Manager system and platform. That is the current version 6, which is both our enterprise and professional edition. So just to give you some assurance there. I believe most of you, if not all of you, are using the Income Manager version 6 platform, enterprise or professional edition. There may be some of you who are still perhaps using our older legacy system, version 5. If there are, you're welcome to our session today. When you migrate to Income Manager Enterprise, I think this session will come in handy for you. Just by way of a bit of intro before I get into our session, a little bit about Imus. The company was founded in 1991, privately owned, provides software services to associations and nonprofits. That's both member management and association software, as well as fundraising software. 180 employees throughout the US, Canada, UK, and Australia, and 80 partners and 2,500 clients in 20 countries. As an aside, ASI has recently formed partnerships with a couple of other leading software providers for integration into their Imus platform, one being Higher Logic and the other being Clouder, both of which are essentially community building platforms that fit into their into the Imus system, just as an aside. The company at the executive leadership level includes Bob Alves, the CEO, and Don Robertson, the president. Donna Benz is vice president. Jocelyn Dyer is the legal counsel. John Bendez, the vice president, global sales, and Gary Kinman is the chief financial officer. So if you have any questions about your billing, just contact him. Okay, as I say, we have company has 25 clients and association member organizations, various types of organizations all listed here. This is some samplings. Besides Income Manager, ASI also has acquired Cause to Give. Some of you may know that. That's a Canadian company out of Toronto. Progress CRM was a UK, or is a UK fundraising system, much like Income Manager, I think, in many ways. And the same applies to a company, a system called Donman in Australia, and another company called Spacemaster. So ASI has acquired a number of smaller companies and integrated them into their overall corporate strategy and activities. And again, a little bit about the Imus platform. By the way, if there are any of you that might be interested in seeing the Imus system as it may apply to Income Manager clients, I will be doing another webcast on April 17th at 2 p.m. And this will be, I'll be demonstrating the Imus platform specifically for Income Manager clients, so they can kind of make a sort of a back-to-back comparison. Imus is a completely different platform, a lot of strengths in a lot of areas. But anyway, for your edification, that will be on April the 17th. While I'm mentioning that, I'll also mention that May 10th, I will be doing another Income Manager client briefing on our communications module. I did that last, I think, November, so anybody that might have missed that, I'll be doing that again in May. Okay, so let's get on with our training session today. And I do have another quick sort of few slides here. We're going to be talking about the Query Wizard and Income Manager. So what are queries? Queries are questions that you ask to your database. And of course, you can ask or create an infinite number of questions. And that's why there's no single query that answers everything. I've had people come to me in the past and say, oh, I can't have one query that answers everything. It's important to know that queries are dynamic, so that if you run your query or ask a question today and you get an answer, and you run the same question tomorrow, if the underlying data has changed, the answer will be different. Okay, so it's not static like it would be in an Excel file. The reasons to create queries. Okay, one, you can use queries to build or marketing campaign, whether it be mail or email. And to be honest, that's probably the most common reason for building queries. I'm going to comment on that a little bit more. I oftentimes see senior management coming to the data entry people and say, well, I want to do a mailing for, you know, the winter newsletter or Christmas campaign or something. And I want, you know, all the donors that have given us $20 or more in the last in the last 3 years, plus anybody that maybe has made a in-memory donation in the last year that you know, live in Vancouver or Toronto and have green eyes, and et cetera, et cetera. The idea being that the query structure, that kind of a question, becomes very, very complex. So if you, in fact, you want to be able to break this down, and I'm going to show you how to do that today, into simpler components, more edible pieces. It's like trying to eat an apple in one bite. You're going to choke. So if you're using queries to build recipient lists and you have a number, several different criteria that you want to create in building your recipient list, break them down into several separate queries, and we'll go through some of those processes today. You can also use queries to build special reports that may not be inherent or native to the built-in reports in Income Manager. Sometimes you want to do some analytical, statistical information from Income Manager for business intelligence, executive decision supporting, and we're going to see an example of that today. We're going to create a query for lifetime values, and use queries to check or verify data. Oftentimes people call us and say, well, you know, I don't know if this data was entered right, or if it was in the right account or category or code, or, you know, so oftentimes it's a very simple matter of doing a query on today's or yesterday's transactions, taking a quick glance on it and seeing if anything irregular kind of pops up. So it's a great way of checking for data validity. Okay, about queries. Queries are always the most challenging function of using any database system. I have used and tried to use query tools in other systems. It doesn't kind of matter what system it is, it's always pretty complicated. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's not really complicated. It's just a question of familiarity. But it certainly is the most challenging part of typically of using any database system. So the Query Wizard is a tool designed to help you create queries relatively easily and avoid having to use SQL or sequential query language to do so. That may look something like this. That can get quite tedious and cumbersome if you need to manually write SQL statements, especially with there's a lot of joins. And when you do finally create a successful query, sometimes you might feel elevated and feel like you've quite accomplished something. And so congratulations when you do. So today we're going to create some various queries. We're going to start with a simple constituent and transaction query. Then we're going to escalate that a little bit and create an aggregate query to demonstrate return lifetime values of our donors. We're going to create queries to provide lapsed donors. Then we're going to use queries, or what I call a purge query, that I would use and it would just kind of be there whenever I need it if I'm going to be doing a communication, an email or mailing communication. I've developed a distribution list, and now I want to purge that query of anybody that shouldn't be on it. We'll see how we're going to use that. Okay, so with that in mind, let's get started. Now, I have Income Manager open here. And there's some assumption that all of you have kind of at least looked at this screen or clicked the button Query Wizard. I'm going to kind of go a little bit slower here, so so everyone is comfortable. I have a list of existing queries demonstrated here. On the right-hand side, there's various buttons. I can run a query, create a new query, modify a query from the first step. By the way, there are 4 steps to creating a query. Or I can just modify the criteria in a query, which is the step 4, the last step. I can delete a query. I can create a query, and then everybody on that list email them using Email Blast. So if you have Email Blast installed, and that would launch Email Blast and email everybody on that query. And I can make a copy of the query. So if you have gone to the effort of creating a query and you want something a little bit different, but you don't want to change the original, just make a copy of it and perhaps change the criteria or some other elements of the query. Okay, so let's get started on right from step 1, creating a new query. A little bit at some of the elements of this form. It doesn't particularly do anything. As query, we're going to be using that in our second example, and an aggregate query is used typically these and say we need a query on a query. Query Wizard doesn't provide for that. You cannot query an existing query, which we would call a nested query. However, we can create a custom SQL statement, which would essentially do the same thing. And you can then, we send you the SQL statement just as a Word document. You copy it and paste it into Income Manager, and you have your custom SQL statement. So we've had some of our community foundation clients request those kinds of things. In the description, typically just put a list of donors and donations last, I don't know, 4 years or something like that. This query is active. And here you can indicate that it can be viewed by other users or not. So how secure or do you want to make this query, or allow other users to edit the query. There's also a provision for returning the top number of records. I can't envision why you might need a reason for doing that, but who knows, there may be. Okay, so that's the first thing is creating, step one is creating a name and describing the query. If your query is kind of complex, nobody kind of understands why you're doing this, you may want to use the description fields a little bit more extensively to kind of give better indication of what it is you're trying to do with this query. So now here's an area where people kind of get hung up a little bit. There's a long list of tables from Income Manager. They're not really the tables, they're what we call views. In Imus, they call these business objects. So it's kind of a view on an underlying table in Income Manager. As fundraisers, for the most part, you are going to be using the constituent table. And if you go to the very end, the transaction table and perhaps the transallocate table. So the transallocate tables are where your, all of your financial information has been recorded as donations, cash sales, along with accounts receivable and other types of transactions as well. Some of these other tables, I think some of them are self-evident, like wherever it says activity, those relate to different kinds of activities within the concept of a particular program. There's annual funds. I haven't included the address in this particular query, the address block or table, but you might want to do that. If I'm going to be doing if I'm going to be using this query for the purposes of an email or a mailing campaign using the communications tool in Income Manager, I don't need the address table at this point, unless I was going to use the query itself for the purpose of the address. You'll see in a moment what I mean by that if I didn't quite make that clear. The other tables you'll want to make note of, and we'll be using this actually in the next query, will be first and last donations, which is common. There's another one just called last donations. There's a table called solicitation. This is a history of all of the communications or solicitations that people have sent out. Okay. All right. So now when it comes to joints, it behooves you to understand the concept of parent-child relationships. So, for example, in Income Manager, just like in many other databases, particularly fundraising databases, a table that holds the constituent information, name, and typically some other biographical information about the constituent with a constituent ID. So that means there's only one constituent. There's only one Homer Simpson or Joe Sample or whoever it happens to be, unless there are duplicates, of course. But so for that person can have multiple donations or transactions, and so that person's ID is also then stored. So let's say Homer Simpson's ID is number 5. His ID is also stored in the transaction table when every time he makes a donation or carries out a financial transaction. Interestingly enough, there's another cascading table called transallocate, and that's the middle form of the donation cash sales form, where we're selecting the account and the credit and the funds and various other fields. So there can be multiple allocations on that particular transaction. Later I'll show you where that form is. I'm sure you've all seen it, just so you understand the concept. So there's another sort of cascading parent-child relationship between transaction and transallocation. Parent being one, and of course child being multiple. So one to many is the nature of the relationship. So we need to join these tables. So typically the most important table, or the higher in terms of the hierarchy, is on the left. In this case, the constituent table goes on the left, and the cascading, the child table, in this case transaction, there may be one or perhaps sometimes more than one join between those two tables. So basically we're saying join constituents and transactions, and the nature of the join is that we're joining from both tables. In other words, there has to be a transaction in order to return the constituent. Okay. The only time you might want to do that differently is if you're looking for people in the database who have never made a donation. So you're looking for something that doesn't exist, in which case you would select all rows from constituents, because they won't have any rows in the transaction table. And then that's another matter of putting in the criteria where there is no transaction. That would give you the people who have never made a donation. But typically, you're going to use the equal join from both tables, okay? Like I say, there are occasionally some other exceptions. All right, so we've made that join, and now we need to also join the transaction table to that's the parent for transaction, to its child table, transallocate, and there's just the one join there. And again, we're joining both transaction and the allocation, okay? So now we have our two joins on all three tables, and there must be information in each of those three tables to return any constituent or any information whatsoever. All right, so that's step two. Step three. So we want the combination. Encourage you to all going to be using this query in the context of building a constituent, or building a distribution or recipient list for a marketing communication, because we're storing a history and it's going to store that constituent ID. We need that. So I would suggest, just as a matter of sort of common practice, unless there's a compelling reason not to, and I guess there can be sometimes, but to always include the constituent ID. Most of the time it's going to make life easier. And then the fields are organized alphabetically. So we're also going to use pull the first name, and these are all the biographical fields attached to the constituent table. You can see that, the field names, and then beside it is the table name. And I also want the last name. And if it's an organization, I also want the organization name. Okay. You can select whatever field you want from this list, of course. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not pulling back or retrieving address information. I could, if I wanted to. I would include the address table and also join the address to the constituent to the address table as well. Okay. Now we're getting into the transaction information. These are all the fields from the transaction table. You can see that it also stores the constituent ID, same ID as from the constituent table. And I'm going to pull in, just by way of example, let's pull in the gift letter, the gift receipt amount, the date, whether it was issued, the number, whatever fields sort of apply for your purposes. The trans amount and the trans date, and from the allocation table, this is where I would pull in things like the account being used. That would be the revenue account typically. Account type. Let's use the credit field. I could use the debit as well. And let's see what else. Oh, and the fund. Okay, that'll do for now. If you wanted, you can see there's fields here relating to tribute information. If you're processing in-memory donations and you've been recording the tributee, this is where you would be picking up that information. Okay, so that's step number 3. Now we put in the criteria on step number 4. Right off the bat, there you'll see the list of fields that are available. They don't have to be, when you're applying criteria, they don't have to be on the fields that you've selected. You can actually apply criteria on fields that you haven't even selected that you want to view. However, I find for all intents and purposes, it's more practical and easier to understand that if I'm applying a criteria on a field, that I want that field displayed in the end result. So it's just kind of common sense in that way. In the middle are the operators. For the most part, they're self-explanatory. I'll maybe try to elaborate a little bit more on some of these fields. To the left top right corner, there's the operand that we call and or. That can sometimes get a little bit complicated. Whoops, sorry. My mouse went ballistic here. Okay. Using and or operators. You're going to see an example later where I'm going to use the or operator. Conceptually, it's important to understand that the or operator takes precedence over and. So, for example, if I wanted everyone who made donations of $100 or more and lived in Toronto, is one condition. So that's a set of conditions. There's 2 parts to that set. Or everybody that lives in Vancouver. So that's a different set of conditions, and there's no reference there to anybody who's made a donation over $100. So I would get results that include everybody who lives in Toronto that gave over $100 and everybody that lives in Vancouver, regardless of how much they gave. So you need to kind of use these parentheses when you're grouping 2 or more sets of conditions. So everybody that lives in Toronto and gave $100 or more, or everybody that lives in Vancouver, or where city is equal to Vancouver, and transaction amount is greater than $100. Okay, you'll see a little bit of what I mean by that. Okay, for our purposes of our query today, though, I'm going to just demonstrate a couple of conditions. I'm going to use the trans date, where the trans date is, I can either use greater than or equal to or greater than, or I can use just greater than. I'm just going to put in a condition here. What would I say, 4 years? So let's go back to, well, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to go back here and change this year to 2004 as of today. So that's for anything greater than March 20th, whoops, sorry, 2014. And add that condition. So the little arrows under the conditional clause. By the way, when you're using a date amount, the criteria will show in the date display or date pop-up, so you can select the date. Okay. And I want to put in another condition where the trans amount was greater than $10. Okay. I also, this table will include all transactions. So that includes like payments and pledge payments, accounts payable, accounts receivable, gifts in kind. I want to exclude kind of gifts in kind or anything that I don't consider a qualified sort of donation. So I'm going to under trans allocate, there's the account field. So this is pulling from the chart of accounts, whatever you've set up in the chart of accounts. And I'm going to say not in I don't want any gifts in kind. This is nice because it's a multi-select. So I don't want any gifts in kind. I don't want any auction item donations. I don't want any donations of food. And I don't want any gift shop sales. Or alternatively, I could have said in and just use the ones that I do want. Okay. So they can't be any of those. That excludes gift shop sales, gifts in kinds of goods or food, auction items, etc. So it's just basically cash. Okay, so I could go on. You can have as many criteria as you want as an example. So let's see what we get as a result of this. Run the query. And here's my query results with the fields that I have selected, as you can see. Okay. All right. A couple of things related to, this is called the data sheet. Kind of looks like an Excel file, but it's not really, but it is called a data sheet. What you want to be aware of is it's very easy to export information from Income Manager by way of a data sheet. Every time a data sheet appears, there's a toolbar across the top that lets you manipulate and do things with that data sheet. Probably the most important of which is to export to Excel. So if you click the little Excel icon, top left-hand corner, it'll say, you know, where do you want to export it to? What format do you want to? And do I want to open it when I export it? Okay. That will output the entire data sheet that you have. You can also export it to Word or RTF format. You can export, etc. Wanted to sort by the trans amount. There's an AZ with a down arrow and ZA with a down arrow. So the ZA, of course, is descending order. So I can sort the trans amount on the descending or the trans date on the descending order. Okay. If you want to find something, there's a binoculars. You can pull up the binoculars or the find box and search the entire data sheet for something in particular that you may be looking for on the data sheet. You can go to a particular record. You can apply filters on this after various kinds of filters. You can hide and freeze columns. You can also sum a column. So I want to sum on trans amount. You'll notice the data sheet is not quite like Excel because it doesn't provide summation in the way that Excel does. But I've highlighted the column and I'm saying, okay, well, there's the totals. Just give me the total on that. Or I can do the sum or average or count, standard deviation, whatever it is I want. So there's, if you just need a quick total on that field, there you go. Okay. A couple of other things about data sheets. You'll notice at the bottom that there's some little record navigation buttons at the very bottom of the data sheet in the bottom left-hand corner. And, if you want to navigate to the first row or to the last row or whatever. One important thing to be cognizant of, along that at the sort of near to the right, there's a little kind of black arrow with a bar in front of it. And if you click that, it sets the maximum number of records. By default, this sets the return records to 10,001 records. Many times clients call us and say, well, you know what? I don't know what's going on here. I know I have 20 or 30,000 clients that meet these conditions or criteria. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, we just got to change that. So you can just, it indicates here that enter 0 to show all records. So if you know you've got 20 or 30,000 records that should be appearing, just put in a 0. And then that will refresh the data sheet and return it. That's obviously for expediency to run the query as efficiently as possible. They put on a maximum number of records returned, but you can easily remove that. Okay, so that's a simple kind of query, 3 tables, some joins, just return the fields we want to see, and enter some simple conditions and criteria, all of which are ands. So the date has to be greater than that date, and it has to be greater than $10, and not including those those accounts that we displayed. You want to be cognizant of the use of accounts because there are different kinds of transactions in an income manager. In particular, here, let me go back to that. Yes, I did. Okay, so when I ran that, and then I ran the query, there's the account. Okay. All right, let's move on. Let's do a lapsed donor query. Going to do a new one. Create a new query. Sorry, no, I'm going to do an aggregate query. That's right. So this is also a financial. Oh, and here is where I need to indicate right from the get-go, create an aggregate query. If I forget this and go to step 2 and then want to go back, it doesn't work. You have to kind of delete it and start over again. So you got to get this right from the get-go, create an aggregate query. And I'm just going to call this donors LTV for lifetime value. Oh, and I'm going to call it, prefix that with 0002 underscore. Okay, I'm not going to bother with the description this time. Basically, for this, I can kind of shortcut this whole process. I'm just going to use the transaction table. Okay, because I just need to find out who they are. That's all. And I'm going to use the constituent ID. Oh, so you'll notice that this form in step 2, when we're doing an aggregate query, is quite different than the step 2 that we used in the previous query. The aggregate query allows you, and it's typically used for aggregating information, summarizing information. So we're going to see how that works. So I'm going to get the constituent ID, and I'm just going to add that. And then the constituent, and I'm going to add that. Here is where I'm going to do some aggregation. I want the transaction amount, and I want the sum of transactions. For each, what I'm doing here is I'm saying, give me the total for the transactions for each constituent. Okay. I'm also going to, I want a count of how many transactions or donations each donor has made during their lifetime. So there's a field here called transno. It really stands for trans number, and I want to get a count of those fields. So I'm going to add that in as well. Okay. And for demonstration purposes, I want to also get a average gift. So if I know the totals and I know the number of transactions, it's going to be relatively easy now for the system to just divide the total by the number of transactions to give me an average of each gift. Okay. I also, so I could just now go with that. By the way, I'm going to, I want to, there's a, at the bottom, there's a sort selection. Even though I showed you how to sort in the datasheet in the previous query that I created, I showed you how you can sort. If it's a very large record set, the datasheet has thousands of records, and you try to sort from using those tools in the toolbar, it can be quite cumbersome and eat up a lot of resources. If you anticipate that your query is going to return a large number of records and you want it sorted, this is the time to do it, really. So let me do that. Let's sort by constituent A to Z. Okay, so just to be aware that that's there, and to use that if you have if you anticipate a large record set. If you're only anticipating, 50 or 100 or even maybe a couple hundred records, you can certainly sort it to data sheet level. The other thing I want to indicate is that I want to sort. I'm sorry, I only want a number of records where the total is above a certain amount. In other words, the sum of the transactions. So show you how that's done, where the trans amount and the sum is greater than, and I might say 10. I want everybody whose lifetime value is greater than $10. Okay? All right. So hopefully you understand the concept here of how we can sum and count and get averages and minimums and maximums from our table. Okay, but this is typically how you use this. So then I'm going to go next. I could, because I'm doing lifetime transactions, I don't care what the beginning and end dates were. We're really talking about did want the Q. So again, by way of example, I can say where the trans date is greater than whatever date I may want. So why don't we say, I don't know, 12, okay? I don't have to have a date here. I can just apply the, let's run it both ways, with and without a date, and see how the results might change. So here I have various people. The first record is constituent. All right, Simpson sent in the last 5 years 23 with an average gift of $161. Well, Michael Baldwin's in there, Joe Blow, etc. Okay. So let me change up a couple things. I'm going to remove the date, but I am going to say because the results of that query had no constituent, and the reason it had no constituents because the transactions are still stored in the transaction table. They were journal entries, and so there was no constituent associated with those journal entries. So I'm going to say where where constituent ID is not empty, and I've taken out the date, and let's see what that looks like. Okay, so that's a little closer to really what I want. All right. Okay, so moving on. Next query is a lapsed donor query. So I'm going to create a new query, and this time, I'm going to call it constituents, and I'm going to call it 0003 lapsed donors. Again, I would typically use first and last trans table, and I'll show you what that means. So the table I need for that, well, first of all, I'm going to pull in my constituents table, and there's a table here called the first and last. So what that does is return the date and amount of their first donation and the date and the amount of their last donation. Okay. So again, constituents, first and last. There's my join equal to both. And typically, again, we want the constituent ID, and maybe you might want to know if the person is deceased or not, since. Where's my, first name, last name, and organization name. And you know what? I'm just going to pull in all of these tables. I need to pull in their last amount and last date. Oh, and the number of gifts and the total amount of their gifts. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. In this case, you know what? I don't think I need to pull in any other conditions or criteria. Let's just run it and see what we get. By the way, that's always you can always do that. One nice thing about this version of Income Manager is you can change up the fields. In the older version, you couldn't change the fields, and you couldn't make any changes once you'd made the created the query. And the version 5 with this, you can, if you need to change the fields or change the criteria, you can certainly do all that, along with sharing it with other staff. So, okay, well, this is kind of close to what we want. So let's maybe sort this on the last amount. Do it descending. Yeah. Okay. So I haven't quite described this properly. I'm sorry. This is what we want as a lab donor query. So obviously we want to define this by what constitutes or what defines a lapsed donor. It could typically it's like a year, could be more than that. In fact, I've seen organizations say most recent lapsed within a year, and then medium lapsed in the last 2 years, and distantly lapsed 3 years ago. So there's different definitions of what constitutes a lapsed donor. But obviously, so let's do that. Let's say where the last date is greater than today's date as of 2 years ago. So we're going to say, whoops, 16. Okay, so no, I'm sorry. This should be less than. Anybody whose last gift occurred previous to either March 20th, 2016, or previous to that date. That's what constitutes a lapsed donor for us. Anybody that's contributed has a last gift date after that date we don't consider as being lapsed. Okay. Okay, so by definition, these people had their last gift occurring prior to more than 2 years ago. And that's our definition of lapsed. Could be, like you say, it could be 1 year ago, could be 6 months ago, however you define a lapsed donor, or even segregate or segment kind of lapsed donors in terms of how you may want to go back to appeal to them. All right, so moving on, what we want to do is another query that I call a purge query that I will use in the context of my mailings and communications. So I'm going to create a new query. Whoops, sorry. And this query will be, I'm just going to call this constituents. And let's call this 1, 2, 3, 4 purge query. And this is something you kind of just keep in your toolbox, your list of queries that you use as needed. And for this query, all we need is the constituent table, because the conditions that we want that defines someone that should receive a communication are all within the constituents table. So again, we're looking for the constituent. We need the constituent ID. If we want, we can have the first name and last name and organization name, maybe. First name, last name, and organization name. And the fields that I want from here, I want to know if they're active. I want to know if they're or not. I want to know if they're deceased or not. I want to know if they have moved, or I want to know if they've indicated they don't want to receive any solicitations. Okay, so I put in those 4 fields that I'm going to define. So how are we going to define this now? Say next, and I'm going to say where active. So by definition, anybody that's active, these are all checkboxes. These are what we call Boolean fields. They're either yes or no, true or false. All these fields that I've selected. So the active field, everybody is active by definition unless you make them inactive. So where active is equal to false, okay, or deceased is equal to true, or, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't use or, the or operator. This is where I should have used the or. So this is where I need to be cognizant. So I need to say, instead of and, I need to say or deceased is equal to true, or moved, where's moved? Moved is equal to true, or where do not solicit or no solicitations is equal to true. Okay? So you see the conditions of the 4 criteria where active is equal to false means they're not active, or they're deceased, or they've moved, or they've requested no solicitation. So this will be my purge query that I'll use for all of my communications whenever I send out a communication. You can run it. And there's the results, which means that each of these people must meet at least one of the conditions that we've asked for. They can meet more. They can meet all 4, but they must meet at least one of the 4 conditions that we've requested. Okay. And so now, if somebody becomes moved or indicates that they don't want any more solicitations, or they happen to become deceased, they're automatically on that list. I don't have to go and kind of refresh that list or whatever. I can use that however I want. So I've got a few more minutes here. I'm going to show you how to use that particular, some of those queries actually. So under messages, I do have another session, as I said, in May the 10th, where we're going to be dealing with communications, and I'm going to cover this in more detail. But just for our purposes today, I'm going to create a new message, and I'm just going to call this, I don't know, direct mail. I'm going to call this 2018 winter DM. It's still winter, unfortunately. Or is it? No, I guess it's spring now, isn't it? And so the delivery method would say mail, could be email. And this is a solicitation. And the campaign is annual campaign. Save it. And I need to go back and find this again now. Winter DM. Okay, so to build my recipient list, I can use lists, constituent types, or queries. So, for example, if we wanted, we could use this list of queries that we created called donors and transactions. And I can add, because that has the constituent ID in it, I can add everybody on that list, on that query, to my distribution list, and it added 14. As I mentioned previously, your ED or your, senior manager may come along and say, oh, I want all of these different conditions, but I also want to include, people who are board members or people who are volunteers. I want them to be on the list as well to get this particular mailing. So I can add event volunteers. I can add different kinds of constituent types. I can add all my friends, anybody that may be a friend, volunteers, etc. Okay. So I've now gone through the process of building this recipient list, and this is where I'm going to use the purge query. Now that I have the list built, I want to make sure there's nobody on this list that shouldn't be, and that will include anybody that is on this purge query that I've just created, and it's going to be up to date as of this moment. Okay, and here's where I'm going to use the query to remove any of those people from my distribution or recipient list, regardless of whether or not they've met other conditions. They're volunteers, they're on the board of directors, they've made donations in the last 2 years, etc., etc. Regardless of all that, they will be removed. Okay, and then of course you have your nice, easy query. By the way, I also have a query here called no email that I created earlier. Has email and has no email. So if you're doing a communication and part of it is going to, let's say a newsletter, for example, part of it might be you're sending to those of whom you have email addresses, you're going to email the newsletter, and to those who don't have emails, you're going to mail the newsletter. So you really want to create two different lists: people that meet all these conditions that have email addresses, and those that don't have email addresses. And I've already created queries for those, and I can use them accordingly in my communication. Where's this summer direct? Whoops, winter 2018 winter newsletter. So if this is a mailing, I want to exclude anybody that has email addresses, because I'll be sending them the newsletter via email and I'll call this 2018 winter email or something. So remove those people from the list. Okay, and there you've got your nice clean list of 9 people remaining. Okay, I'll be covering off this in more detail in my session May the 10th. Okay, I think that wraps it up. It's almost an hour. I hope you found that helpful, useful. I didn't cover every detail, but I tried to share some tricks and tips with you as well, and creating queries. Don't be intimidated, and if you are, just give us a call. Thank you. Are we there?
Michael, can you hear me okay?
Hello?
Michael?
Now I hear you, yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, I hear you.
Yeah, I'm having a little bit of internet issue, so I'm going to go ahead and feed you the questions that I have in the queue, and if you need for me to repeat any of them, just let me know. The first question is, when I copy a query and then try to run the query, I always get the following message: incorrect syntax near the word inner.
Well, I guess my question back would be, does the original query work? If the original query works and the copy doesn't, something about an inner join, that's interesting. I've never seen that before, and I don't have an answer just off the top of my head, but please send me an email or call me, and we'd be glad to try and help you out and figure out what's going on in that regard. My contact information. Okay. Yeah, that's. I don't have an immediate response to that. We'd have to really kind of look at it and delve into it a little bit more. You know, the other option may be just kind of delete it and start over again. It just depends on whether the original one works. So.
Okay. My next question is, what would be the best way to see what your donor retention is?
Donor retention. You would be looking at the frequency of donations. A little bit of that was kind of maybe contained in the last gift when I was doing the lapsed donor query. By manipulating some of the queries that I was working with today, both the lapsed donor query or the, not so much the lifetime value, but you want to be looking at the number, the recency of transactions and donations over the last maybe 2 or 3 years. Again, I'd need to know in a little more detail, you know, specifically what it is you want, but you know, the capabilities are there, and doing kind of an RFM in a loose sort of way: recency, frequency, money, distribution. And so some of that is kind of available in Income Manager by doing queries, not in a complete sense of doing quintiles, using quintiles for an RFM analysis, but you know, close enough.
Okay, that is the last question in my queue for you, Michael.
Okay. All right. Well, if you have any other questions that come up later, feel free to contact me. There's email me. And of course, we do have ongoing support. Hopefully, you're all clients with your client login credentials to Zendesk if you do have issues. But of course, we're here to help you utilize and exploit Income Manager to its fullest potential for you. Thank you.